Should you drink the ramen broth? After you finish the noodles and toppings, you look down at the bowl. A rich, fragrant broth still shines at the bottom, and your hand almost automatically reaches for the spoon. Many people have felt that tiny tug-of-war between wanting to enjoy every last drop and worrying about salt, calories, and their health. Should you go ahead and drink all the ramen broth as part of the dish, or is it smarter for your body and for society to leave it in the bowl? In this video, we run a 10-round, 20-turn debate where both sides clash head-on, arguing as equals about taste, culture, health, and social costs. Which side do you agree with more? The side that says you should drink it, or the side that says you should not? Tell us in the comments. Now, let's get started.
I think you basically should drink the ramen broth. Japanese ramen is designed not as noodles to eat, but as a dish where you enjoy noodles and broth together. And many shops spend tens of hours making the stock and adjusting the salt so that it ends up around 6 to 7 grams of salt per bowl. The WHO recommends keeping daily sodium intake under 2,000 milligrams, less than 5 grams of salt, but even so, I don't think there is solid statistical evidence that enjoying the broth once or twice a week as a treat in itself significantly increases health risks.
That's a very optimistic way of looking at it. While the WHO recommends less than 5 grams of salt per day, official Japanese surveys show that average daily salt intake is already excessive, at about 11.0 grams for men and 9.3 grams for women. On top of that, a single bowl of rich tonkotsu ramen broth alone can contain the equivalent of 8 to 10 grams of salt, which means you can easily take in 1 to 2 days' worth of salt at once. In a country where high blood pressure and strokes are already serious population-level issues, making a habit of finishing the broth and brushing it off as only once or twice a week is very lax risk management.
But if we're going to talk about salt risk, we should be looking at total daily intake rather than picking on ramen. International analyses show that most dietary salt comes from everyday processed foods like bread, processed meats, and prepared dishes. And the contribution of any single meal is relatively limited. In fact, if you consciously reduce the salt in your daily cooking by about 1 gram and cut back on instant foods and snacks, you can lower your baseline intake. Then you can still fully enjoy the broth when you have ramen as a special treat. That kind of on-off balance gives you higher psychological satisfaction and leads to a more sustainable approach to salt reduction.
I don't deny that everyday salt reduction is important, but that is not a free pass to say it's fine to drink the broth. There are estimates that just leaving the broth of restaurant soups and ready-made noodle dishes can cut 2 to 3 grams of salt per meal. People who routinely finish the broth of miso soup at dinner, cup noodles, and ramen are easily exceeding the WHO's upper limit. The point is whether you draw a line there or not, and over the long term, that shows up as differences in blood pressure and stroke risk.
The discussion tends to fixate on nutrition, but ramen broth also has certain functional aspects. It's rich in fats, gelatin-derived collagen, and amino acids. And there are reports that taking it together with a small amount of solids after exercise or when you feel under the weather can provide energy that's relatively easy to digest and absorb. There are even studies suggesting that chicken soup may help relieve upper respiratory symptoms. So it's an oversimplification to label all broth as bad. I think it's rational to make use of broth depending on your condition and timing, and insisting on never drink it is an extreme stance.
Bringing up that kind of functionality is a change of subject. The situation of sipping a small amount of chicken broth when you have a cold is completely different from, say, finishing a bowl of gyro-style ramen with around 1,600 kilocalories and way over 2,000 milligrams of sodium in one go. If anything, when you're not feeling well, you should reduce the burden on the kidneys and cardiovascular system. So giving someone high-fat, high-salt broth as nutrition actually goes against the evidence. If you consider not just the average, but also worst-case scenarios, then making don't drink it the default is logically more consistent.
Then how do you think about frequency? Many epidemiological studies look at the relationship between high-salt diets overall and cardiovascular risk, not at individual dishes. Equating someone who drinks the broth once a week with someone who eats convenience store bentos and sweetbreads every day and constantly takes in 9 to 12 grams of salt seems unbalanced. The real problem is the total dietary pattern, and lumping in a few dozen bowls a year where someone chooses to finish the broth as if they should all be banned is too coarse-grained an assessment of risk.
If you're gonna bring up frequency, then we should also weigh the cost of not drinking the broth, which is very small. By the time you've eaten the noodles and toppings, your satiety center is already largely satisfied. So it's hard to argue that finishing the broth dramatically changes fullness or satisfaction. In fact, many nutritional guidelines say leave the soup when you eat noodles, and you hardly ever hear complaints that it ruins people's quality of life. If satisfaction is almost the same, then choosing the option that cuts extra salt and fat is the rational thing to do.
But you can't ignore the role of taste and culture. Ramen artisans adjust the balance of stock and flavored oil down to the milliliter, aiming to create a broth whose flavor stands on its own. If customers always leave the broth by default, shops will be pushed toward safe and thin broths, tailored to profitability and health trends. As a result, the overall diversity of ramen culture could suffer. I think there should still be room for a segment of customers who actively choose to savor a bold bowl, fully aware of the risks, and drink the broth as part of that cultural experience.
If you justify it with culture, then you could use exactly the same logic to defend the old smoking culture. In reality, high blood pressure and cardiovascular disease impose costs on society as a whole through medical expenses and reduced quality of life. The Japanese Society of Hypertension also calls for reducing salt intake to under 6 grams per day and strongly recommends cutting down on salty soups, and ramen is one of the single dishes with the largest impact per serving. From a public health standpoint, prioritizing lifestyle disease prevention over chef's artistic ideals is the more consistent attitude.
We need to distinguish between public health messaging and individual choice. As a policy, it's perfectly fine to communicate that it's preferable not to drink all the broth, while still not going so far as to restrict an individual's freedom to occasionally choose to drink it on the limited occasions they eat ramen each year. If shops clearly display salt and calorie content, and people understand what they're ingesting when they decide to finish the broth, that act can actually raise awareness of the numbers. In that sense, I see value in leaving the choice to the individual.
The assumption that if you provide information, people will adjust their behavior on their own is quite optimistic in practice. There's no shortage of reports from countries that mandated calorie and salt labeling, showing that average intake decreased only modestly. Behavioral economics repeatedly demonstrates that people tend to overvalue immediate pleasure and undervalue future health risks. That is precisely why we need simple, strong rules like don't drink the soup of noodle dishes, not educational strategies that assume people will stop at a reasonable amount while enjoying the broth.
If you're worried about human bias, the answer shouldn't be a binary choice between drink all and zero. We should be proposing ways of moderating how people drink it. For example, savor a few sips of broth at the beginning, but once you finish the noodles, don't drink the rest. Or skip extra noodles and instead allow yourself a bit more broth. Or refrain from ordering rice on the side and enjoy the broth instead, thus controlling total calories while still getting some of the flavor experience. Realistic adjustment strategies like these are more likely to be followed than extreme prohibitions.
Those strategies still rely on self-control and can easily collapse in real life. Once people start drinking, they often can't stop. That's precisely why you need a predetermined rule and a hard stop. It's similar to telling someone with alcohol dependence to drink in moderation and expecting it to work. There are also individual differences in salt sensitivity, and in Japan, data show that nearly 40% of middle-aged and older adults have hypertension. For populations like that, we need strong messages along the lines of the default is to leave the broth, not weak advice that leaves the door open to finishing it.
Equating ramen lovers with people dependent on alcohol is going too far. Many ramen fans naturally reduce how often they go as they age, and when their medical checkups show bad results, they voluntarily cut back. Treating everyone as a potential addict and imposing heavy behavioral restrictions is dismissive of personal autonomy and enjoyment. For those at high risk, doctors can provide individual instructions like limit soups, while for everyone else, we can disclose information and leave the choice up to them. That seems like a more reasonable balance between freedom and health.
It's equally unrealistic to assume that everyone gets regular checkups, understands the results, and adjusts accordingly. In fact, those who skip checkups or don't know how to interpret the results are often the ones who rely heavily on cheap, high-calorie eating out, the quintessential example being ramen. For those people, finishing the broth is a trap that silently accumulates risk. That's why I believe shops should move toward designing bowls on the premise that broth will be left. For example, making low-salt recipes the default and charging extra for stronger flavors.
Once you start telling shops to redesign their bowls, you're heading toward the standardization of taste and portion size. Chains choosing to focus on reduced salt menus is one thing, but if you impose uniform health standards on independent shops as well, bold and guilty pleasure ramen places will be squeezed out. The food service industry serves diverse customer needs, and singling out ramen for stricter treatment isn't fair. With instant noodles and salty snacks still largely unchecked, singling out broth finishing as the main villain is unbalanced in my view.
The point isn't to single ramen out, but to start with the behaviors that have the largest impact. There aren't many dishes where you can take in more than a full day's worth of salt and a huge amount of fat in a single sitting, but ramen is one of them. It's quick to eat, and its highly palatable seasoning encourages repeat consumption. Instant noodles alone provide about 900 to 1,600 milligrams of sodium per serving. And if you add the habit of finishing the broth of bag and cup noodles, the burden on the body grows even more. From a public health perspective, finishing ramen broth is a textbook example of a high-risk, low-return behavior, and the need to put a brake on it still stands.
In the end, I think the real issue is whether you consciously frame ramen broth not as a health food, but as an indulgent treat. It's not something you drink every day, but something you might intentionally finish after a big day of work or when eating out with friends, fully aware of the risks. A society that tries to regulate even that level of freedom may extend statistical life expectancy, but it risks diminishing the richness of food culture and overall life satisfaction. For that reason, I maintain the position that, under certain conditions, you should be allowed to drink the broth.
From my perspective, the conclusion is that we need to redesign that very idea of a reward. In an aging society where medical costs keep rising, each individual's small choices will eventually show up as higher taxes and insurance premiums. Instead of glorifying the act of finishing a salt and fat-laden broth as rich food culture, we should create a new standard where people fully enjoy the noodles and toppings but routinely leave the soup. That's why I strongly argue that, considering the health risks and social costs, ramen broth is basically something you should not drink.
This concludes our 10-round debate on whether you should drink the ramen broth. Do you think it's better to savor every last drop or to leave the soup for the sake of your health and society? Tell us in the comments how you handle ramen broth and what you personally keep in mind when you eat it.